This 4-year-old beggar girl gets beaten by a cop in the middle of the street, but a millionaire reveals a secret that makes the cop start crying immediately. Comment what you think will happen. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The September rain was coming down hard on the brick streets of Aspen, turning the afternoon into a grim scene that mirrored the hopelessness in Isabella's eyes. At 6 years old, the little girl ran barefoot across the slick pavement, her brown hair plastered to her dirty, tear-streaked face. In her trembling little hands, she clutched a piece of stale bread, the only food she'd managed to find on that cold day. Her torn and soaked clothes told a story of abandonment that she didn't yet know how to explain. For 3 months, she had been living on the streets of the resort town, sleeping under awnings and eating scraps she found in restaurant trash cans. Her big, dark eyes carried a sadness too profound for such a young child. "Hold it right there, you little street urchin!" The gruff voice of Officer Mark Venner echoed through the empty streets. At 45 years old, he was known around town for his excessive strictness and explosive temper. His heavy footsteps approached rapidly, making Isabella run even more desperately. "I saw you steal that bread from the bakery," Mark shouted, his face red with anger. "Get back here now!" Isabella tripped over a loose brick in the pavement and fell to her knees on the wet ground. The sharp pain in her knee brought a scream from her, but what hurt most was the terror of being caught. She had learned on the streets that angry adults meant only one thing: more suffering. Mark reached her and yanked her arm with unnecessary force. "Where are your parents? Who taught you to steal?" "I didn't steal it," Isabella sobbed, trying to protect herself with her free arm. "The man at the bakery said I could take it." "Liar!" Mark shoved her brutally, causing the girl to fall again on the soaked ground. "Kids like you are a problem in this town. I'm taking you down to the station and—" "What's going on here?" A deep, authoritative voice interrupted the scene. Richard Sterling, 52 years old, stepped out of his imported car with an expression of indignation on his face. His expensive clothes contrasted sharply with the tense atmosphere of the wet street. Richard was known in Aspen as a successful entrepreneur, owner of a handcrafted furniture factory that employed dozens of people in the region. His imposing appearance and firm voice commanded respect, but his eyes carried a sadness that few managed to perceive. "Mr. Sterling," Mark tried to justify his actions, "this girl was shoplifting at the bakery. It's my duty." "Your duty is to protect, not assault children." Richard knelt beside Isabella, noticing her injured knee and the terror in her eyes. Something inside him clenched painfully. "Are you hurt, little one?" Isabella stared at him distrustfully, shrinking back even further. Her experience on the streets had taught her that kind adults were sometimes the most dangerous. But there was something different in the man's gaze, a familiar pain that she recognized in herself. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I just wanted a piece of bread." Richard felt a pang in his chest that he couldn't explain. The image of the wet and frightened girl awakened memories he'd been trying to keep buried for 3 years. Memories of another child, with curly hair and a sweet smile, who had disappeared without a trace. "Mark, how old do you think this child is?" Richard asked, his voice controlled but laden with emotion. "Where are her parents?" The officer hesitated, for the first time questioning his own actions. She's been living on the streets for a few months. Nobody knows where she came from. She just showed up one day and you thought pushing her to the ground was the solution." Richard stood up, his height intimidating Mark. "This child needs help, not violence." Isabella watched the argument between the two men, confused and still frightened. She didn't understand why the well-dressed stranger was defending her, but for the first time in months, someone seemed to care about her. The rain continued to fall, and Richard noticed how the girl was shivering with cold. Without thinking twice, he took off his expensive coat and placed it over her shoulders. The simple gesture made Isabella look at him in surprise, as if she had never experienced such kindness. "What's your name?" Richard asked, crouching down again to be at her level. "Isabella," she replied softly, still clutching the piece of bread to her chest. "Isabella," he repeated, and the name seemed to resonate strangely in his mind. "How long have you been alone?" The question made the girl's eyes fill with tears again. She didn't know for sure how long it had been since she woke up in a distant park, without clear memories of how she had gotten there. Just confusing fragments of frightening voices and dark places she preferred not to remember. "I don't know," she whispered. "A long time." Mark, seeing the situation change completely, tried to regain control. "Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, the situation with street children is more complicated than you imagine. This girl may be involved in..." "In what?" Richard interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "In trying to survive, in looking for food?" He looked at Isabella again, seeing in her something that touched him deeply. "When was the last time you ate a real meal?" Isabella couldn't answer. The meals were confused in her memory, with leftovers and crumbs found here and there. The simple question made her realize how hungry and exhausted she was. At that moment, a decision formed in Richard's mind. It was impulsive, perhaps irrational, but he felt he couldn't simply walk away and leave that child to her own devices. There was something in her that awakened all his dormant protective instincts. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand to Isabella. "I'll take you to a warm place and give you a proper meal." Isabella hesitated, looking at the outstretched hand. Her experience on the streets screamed not to trust, but something in the man's gentle voice made her want to believe that maybe, just maybe, there were still good people in the world. When she finally placed her little hand in his, Richard felt a mixture of hope and terror that he hadn't experienced in years. He didn't yet know that that decision would forever change not only the girl's life, but also reveal dark secrets that connected both their pasts in unimaginable ways. The Sterling mansion stood majestically among the pines in the hills of Aspen, its large windows offering a panoramic view of the town that stretched out below. Richard drove in silence, watching in the rearview mirror as Isabella huddled in the back seat, still wearing his coat that swallowed her completely. During the 20-minute drive, the girl didn't say a word, her big eyes fixed on the passing landscape. Richard tried to start some conversations, but she responded only with timid nods or almost inaudible whispers. There was something disturbing in the way she looked at everything around her, as if she recognized places she shouldn't know. "We're here," Richard announced, stopping the car in front of the electronic gate. Isabella watched the imposing house with a mixture of admiration and fear. It was bigger than any place she could remember having been. The front door opened even before they arrived, revealing Vivian Sterling. At 48 years old, she maintained a natural elegance even in casual clothes, but her blue eyes carried a coldness that had settled there 3 years ago. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, and her erect posture demonstrated the rigid control she exercised over herself. "Richard," Vivian frowned as she saw her husband accompanied by the dirty, wet girl. "What's this?" "This is Isabella," Richard explained, placing a protective hand on the child's shoulder. "She needs our help." Vivian studied the girl carefully, and something strange happened. For a very brief moment, her features softened, as if she were seeing something familiar in that dirty face. But soon, the cold expression returned. "We can't just bring street kids into our house, Richard," she said, lowering her voice. "Have you lost your mind?" "She has nowhere to go." Richard's voice came out louder than he intended. "I found a cop assaulting her on the street because she was hungry." Isabella followed the discussion without fully understanding, but she could feel the tension in the air. The beautiful woman didn't want her to stay there, that was clear. She began to take steps backward, preparing to run again. "No," Vivian said suddenly, noticing the girl's movement. "Don't go." Her voice came out softer, almost vulnerable. It's complicated." Richard noticed the change in his wife's tone. In the last 3 years, since Katerina's disappearance, Vivian had transformed into a completely different person. The warm and loving woman he had known had closed herself off in an almost impenetrable emotional armor. "At least let's give her a bath and a meal," Richard suggested. "Then we'll decide what to do." Vivian nodded reluctantly, but her eyes couldn't stray from Isabella. There was something about the girl that bothered her and attracted her at the same time, a disturbing familiarity that she couldn't explain. They entered the house, and Isabella was amazed by the luxurious decor. Persian rugs covered polished wood floors, expensive paintings decorated the walls, and elegant furniture filled the spacious rooms. But what caught her attention most were the family photographs scattered throughout the house. In one of them, the couple was seen smiling next to a girl with curly hair and bright eyes. The child in the photo seemed to be about 7 years old and was holding a small puppy in her arms. Isabella stopped in front of the image, feeling a strange connection that she couldn't explain. "Who is she?" Isabella asked, pointing to the photo. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard and Vivian exchanged looks laden with pain, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. "That was our daughter," Richard replied finally, his voice choked with emotion. "Katerina. Where is she now?" Isabella's innocent question cut like a knife. Vivian turned abruptly and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Richard sighed deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. She's not with us anymore," he explained, trying to find words that a 6-year-old could understand. "Something bad happened a few years ago." Isabella nodded solemnly, as if she perfectly understood what it means to lose someone important. There was a maturity in her eyes that was disturbing in such a young child. "I've lost people too," she said softly. "Sometimes I don't remember exactly who, but I know I've lost them." The statement left Richard intrigued. How could such a young child talk about loss so naturally, and what kind of trauma could cause such severe memory lapses? Vivian returned a few minutes later, bringing clean clothes in her arms. "These were too small, but they'll do temporarily," she said, avoiding looking directly at Isabella. When the girl left to take a bath, accompanied by Vivian, Richard was left alone in the room, looking at the photographs of Katerina. The physical similarity between the two girls was not obvious. Katerina had light, curly hair, while Isabella was dark-haired with straight hair. But there was something more subtle, an expression in her eyes, a way of tilting her head, that bothered him deeply. 20 minutes later, Isabella came down the stairs transformed. The clean clothes, although a little big, made all the difference, but it was her reaction to seeing the table set for dinner that most impressed Richard. The girl stopped at the entrance to the dining room, her eyes filling with tears. "Is everything okay?" he asked, concerned. It's very beautiful," she whispered. "It's been a long time since I've seen a table like this." During dinner, Isabella ate slowly, as if she were savoring each bite. Vivian watched every movement of the girl, noticing small details that made her uneasy. The way she held the fork, how she chewed thoughtfully, how she wiped her lips with the napkin, everything seemed strangely familiar. "Isabella," Vivian said suddenly, "do you remember where you lived before you were on the street?" The girl stopped eating and was thoughtful for long seconds. "Sometimes I have dreams," she replied finally. "There's a house with a garden and a woman who sings. But when I wake up, I can't remember exactly." "And your parents?" Vivian insisted, ignoring her husband's warning look. "I don't know." Isabella lowered her eyes. "There's a lot I can't remember. It's like my head has dark parts where I can't go." The answer left the couple in silence. It was evident that the girl had suffered severe trauma, possibly causing some kind of amnesia. But there was something more in her words, a disturbing lucidity about her own condition. Later, when Isabella was already sleeping in the guest room, Richard and Vivian talked in the study. "We can't keep her here," Vivian said, but her voice didn't carry the conviction of the words. Why not? Richard asked. We have space, resources, and she clearly needs care. Because, Vivian hesitated, struggling to find the right words. Because when I look at her, I see... Katerina, Richard completed softly. No, Vivian exclaimed. It's not just that. It's something else. It's as if she knows things she shouldn't know. Did you notice how she reacted to the house? As if she'd been here before. Richard had noticed, but he had tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling. Maybe it's just coincidence. And that scar on her right arm? Vivian continued. Did you see when she raised her sleeve? It's shaped almost identically to the one Katerina had. The comment made Richard freeze. He had noticed the mark, but had tried not to give it importance. Now mentioned directly, it became impossible to ignore. What are you insinuating? He asked, although he feared the answer. I don't know, Vivian sighed. I just feel that there's something we don't know about this girl. Something important that she doesn't remember herself or doesn't want to tell. That night, neither of them could sleep. Meanwhile, in the guest room, Isabella awoke from a fragmented nightmare, filled with confused images of a curly-haired girl crying in a dark room. In the dream, she tried to comfort her, whispering that everything would be all right. But the other child just cried louder, asking for her parents. 3 weeks had passed since Isabella arrived at the Sterling mansion, and a strange routine had settled in. The girl demonstrated a disturbing capacity for adaptation, as if she intuitively knew how to behave in that luxurious environment. Vivian, initially resistant, found herself increasingly obsessed with the child's presence. Richard watched with growing concern as his wife began to treat Isabella almost like a living doll. She bought expensive clothes for the girl, insisted on styling her hair in specific ways, and often murmured, "My little one," while fussing over her. It was behavior bordering on obsessive. "Vivian, we need to talk," Richard said one morning, finding his wife meticulously organizing Isabella's new clothes. "You're getting too attached to the girl." "Don't be ridiculous," she replied, without looking up from the small articles of clothing. "I just want her to feel welcome." "Welcome is different from replacement," Richard retorted, and his words made Vivian freeze. "How dare you?" Vivian turned, her blue eyes shining with anger and pain. "I would never try to replace Katerina." "Then stop dressing Isabella in clothes just like the ones Katerina wore," Richard said, pointing to the blue dress in her hands. "Stop putting the same braids in her hair. And especially stop calling her my little one when you think no one is listening." The discussion was interrupted by a knock on the door. Richard had made an important decision in recent days and hired Miriam Andrews, a psychologist specializing in childhood trauma. At 35 years old, Miriam carried an iron determination shaped by her own experience of growing up in a vulnerable situation. "Good morning," Miriam greeted the couple, immediately noticing the tension in the air. "Where is Isabella?" "In the garden," Richard replied. "She likes to be there alone in the morning." Miriam found the girl sitting under a leafy tree, talking softly to herself. As she approached, she realized that Isabella wasn't talking to herself. She was dialoguing with someone imaginary. "And then she cried a lot," Isabella was saying to the empty space beside her, "but I told her that her parents were coming to get her. I promised they would." "Hello, Isabella," Miriam said gently, sitting down on the grass beside the girl. "Who were you talking to?" Isabella looked at her with those big, wise eyes that were too knowing for her age. "With a friend," she replied simply. "An imaginary friend." "No," Isabella shook her head. "A real friend. But she's not here now." Miriam felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in the way the girl spoke that suggested that this friend was not a product of her imagination, but a real memory of someone important. During the following weeks, Miriam conducted several sessions with Isabella, trying to map the gaps in her memory. The girl demonstrated clear signs of dissociative amnesia, probably caused by severe trauma. But the most disturbing thing was the fragments she could remember. Sometimes I dream about a dark room, Isabella recounted one afternoon, drawing houses in her notebook. There are other children there, and they're all scared. There's a man who speaks softly, and a woman who smells sweet, but is mean. Do you remember anything else about that place? Miriam asked, trying to keep her voice calm. There's a girl with curly hair who always cried, Isabella continued, her hands stopping drawing. She said she wanted to go home, to her parents. I tried to make her feel better. Miriam exchanged a meaningful look with Richard, who had insisted on participating in that session. The description of the girl with curly hair was causing a visible reaction in him. Isabella, Miriam said carefully, do you remember the name of that girl? The child was thoughtful for long minutes, her eyes focusing on something distant. Katerina, she whispered finally. Her name was Katerina. The name fell on the room like a bomb. Richard stood up abruptly, his hands trembling. For 3 years he had tortured himself imagining what had happened to his daughter, and now an unknown child was describing someone who seemed exactly like her. Are you sure about that name? Richard asked, his voice rough with emotion. Isabella nodded. Katerina. She always talked about her parents, about how good they were, and how much they loved her. She said they had a big house, and that her father made beautiful furniture. The words hit Richard like punches. Katerina really knew that he worked with furniture. It was one of the things he was most proud of, showing his daughter the pieces he created. But how could an unknown child know this? Where were you? Miriam asked, realizing that she had discovered a crucial clue. I don't remember exactly. Isabella frowned, struggling to recover the fragmented memories. It was a place with many doors. The children stayed in small rooms. Sometimes people came to pick some up, but they never came back. The description painted a terrible picture that Miriam recognized from her studies on child exploitation. She knew she needed to conduct the investigation very carefully so as not to traumatize the girl further. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He walked through the house like a ghost, stopping in front of the photographs of Katerina and trying to process what he had discovered. If Isabella was telling the truth, it meant that his daughter had suffered unimaginable horrors before. He couldn't complete the thought. That's when he heard footsteps in the kitchen. He went downstairs and found Vivian preparing a late-night snack for Isabella, who was sitting at the table in her pajamas. Nightmare? Richard asked, approaching the girl. I can't sleep, Isabella replied. I keep thinking about Katerina. Vivian froze at the sound of her lost daughter's name. During the previous weeks, Richard had told her about the revelations in the sessions with Miriam, but she had refused to accept the possibility. Isabella, Vivian said, sitting next to the girl, are you sure you knew a girl named Katerina? I am, Isabella replied firmly. She was my best friend there. We always tried to take care of each other. And what happened to her? The question came out in a painful whisper. Isabella lowered her eyes, and tears began to run down her face. One day she got very sick. She coughed a lot and had a fever. I asked them to help her, but they said she was going to be okay. After a few days, she stopped waking up. The silence that followed was broken only by Vivian's stifled sobs. Isabella's simple and innocent description had painted a devastating picture of Katerina's fate. She talked about you every day, Isabella continued, looking at the couple. She said that her daddy was the strongest man in the world and that her mommy sang the most beautiful songs. She was sure that you would come and get her. Richard collapsed into a chair, finally allowing the tears he had held back for 3 years to begin to flow. Vivian hugged Isabella instinctively, and for the first time since Katerina's disappearance, she felt that she might find some kind of closure. Why didn't you tell us this before? Vivian asked, stroking the girl's hair. I didn't know you were her parents, Isabella explained. I only realized it when I saw the photos in the house. Then I understood why I felt so at home here. It's as if a part of Katerina is still in this place. The next morning, Richard made a decision that would change the course of the entire investigation. He called Theodore Ted Campos, a retired police officer who worked as a private investigator. At 58 years old, Ted knew all the dark secrets of Aspen, including rumors about illegal activities that local authorities preferred to ignore. "I need you to investigate something discreetly," Richard said when Ted arrived at his house. "I believe my daughter may have been the victim of some kind of child exploitation ring in the region." Ted listened attentively as Richard recounted Isabella's revelations. The investigator had worked on similar cases in the past and knew that these situations were more common than people imagined, especially in tourist towns where vulnerable children could go unnoticed. "I'll start by checking disappearances of children in the last 5 years, Ted said. "If there really was an operation like that, it must have left traces." While the adults discussed, Isabella played in the garden, seemingly oblivious to the investigations that her presence had triggered. But there were moments when she stopped and looked at the horizon with a disturbingly mature expression, as if she knew that terrible secrets were about to come to light. That afternoon, Mark Venner paid an unexpected visit to the mansion. The police officer who had assaulted Isabella 3 weeks before seemed transformed. His eyes carried a deep guilt that consumed him from within. "I came to apologize," he said, looking directly at Isabella, "and to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." Mark Venner looked like he had aged 10 years in the 3 weeks that had passed since the first encounter with Isabella. His stooped shoulders and tormented gaze revealed a man consumed by guilt. When he entered the Sterling's living room, his hands were visibly trembling. "There are things you need to know," he began, avoiding looking directly at Isabella, who was playing silently in the corner of the room. "About the disappearances of children in the region, about my own daughter." Richard and Vivian exchanged tense glances. Miriam, who had remained in the house to monitor the development of the case, moved closer discreetly. "My daughter Sophia disappeared 5 years ago," Mark continued, his voice failing. "She was 7 years old. One day she was playing in the Central Park, the next she had vanished without a trace." "Why have we never heard about this?" Richard asked. "Because I was a coward," Mark replied bitterly. "I was pressured by influential people in the city not to make too much noise about the case. They said it was better for everyone if I conducted a discreet investigation. That too much fuss could hurt tourism." Isabella stopped playing and looked at the police officer with interest. There was something in his story that awakened nebulous memories in her mind. "Sophia had dark, straight hair," Mark continued, "very similar to—" He stopped, looking at Isabella. "When I saw her on the street that day, for a moment I thought it was her. That's why I reacted so violently. Guilt and hope drove me crazy." Vivian moved closer to Isabella instinctively, a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by Miriam. The psychologist began to understand that the family dynamics were becoming complicated in worrying ways. "You said influential people," Richard interrupted. "Who exactly?" Mark hesitated, clearly struggling against years of forced silence. "The former Mayor Roth, the previous police chief, who retired suddenly shortly after Sophia's disappearance, and—" He stopped again. "And who else?" Richard insisted. "Dr. Henry Alvarenga, the most respected pediatrician in town." The name caused an immediate impact. Dr. Alvarenga was known to everyone in Aspen, especially for his work with underprivileged children. The idea that he could be involved in something sinister seemed impossible. "That doesn't make sense," Vivian protested. "Dr. Alvarenga treated Katerina since she was little. He was like a grandfather to her." "That's exactly what made him perfect for the role," said a new voice at the door. Theodore Campos had arrived, carrying a folder full of documents. Easy access to the children, the trust of the families, medical knowledge to keep the victims sedated when necessary. The investigator entered the room, his somber expression revealing disturbing discoveries. "I've spent the last few days investigating, and I've found a pattern. In the last 8 years, at least 12 children have disappeared in the region. All were between 5 and 9 years old, all from families who had consulted Dr. Alvarenga in the months before. Isabella, who had been silent until then, stood up suddenly. "I remember him," she said, her voice small but clear. "The doctor who smelled of medicine and spoke softly. He came to see the children when they got sick." Everyone in the room froze. It was the first time that Isabella had provided specific details about her captors. "Was he kind?" Miriam asked carefully. Isabella shook her head. "He pretended to be. But when he was alone with us, he was different. He gave injections that made us sleep, and when we woke up, sometimes a child had disappeared." Theodore opened his folder and pulled out some photographs. "Isabella, do you recognize any of these people?" The girl looked at the photos carefully, her expression becoming increasingly tense. When she came to a specific photo, her face paled. "This woman," she pointed. "She was always there. She pretended to be a nurse, but the children were afraid of her. She chose who was going to leave." The photo showed Karen Silva, a nurse who had worked in Dr. Alvarenga's office for more than a decade before moving to Los Angeles 2 years ago. "Where were you kept?" Ted asked. "Do you remember the location?" Isabella closed her eyes, concentrating. "It was a big house, but hidden. It had a basement with many small rooms. It was in a place with many trees, far from the city. The Alvarenga family's property," Mark murmured. "They have a country house in the mountains, inherited from his grandparents. I always thought it was strange that it was never used." Richard stood up abruptly, his breathing quickening. "My daughter was trapped in that place, being... He couldn't finish the sentence. Vivian hugged Isabella tightly, tears running down her face. "You took care of our Katerina, didn't you? You were the only friend she had in that horrible place." Isabella nodded, and for the first time since arriving at the house, she allowed herself to cry openly. "I tried to protect her. When she got sick, I asked for help, but they didn't care. I held her hand until she stopped breathing." The revelation completely broke the composure of everyone in the room. Richard punched the wall hard, while Vivian rocked Isabella as if she were a baby. Mark wept silently, reliving his own loss. "We need to act," Ted said, his professional voice contrasting with the emotion in the room. "Dr. Alvarenga is still active. If there really is a ring operating, other children may be in danger right now." "But how?" Richard asked. "If influential people were protecting this operation, how can we be sure they still aren't?" It was then that Miriam had an idea. "Isabella," she said, "do you remember any other details about that place? Anything that can help us find it?" The girl thought for long minutes. "There was a dog," she said finally. "A big brown dog that was chained up. He barked every time someone arrived." "And were there other adults besides Dr. Alvarenga and the nurse?" "Yes," Isabella nodded. "A younger man who drove the white van, and an older woman who cooked for us. She was always angry and shouted when we made noise." Ted meticulously wrote down every detail. "This information is valuable. I'll start investigating the Alvarenga family property immediately." "I'm going with you," Mark declared. "I can't stand by while this continues to happen." "It's dangerous," Ted warned. "If they find out we're investigating—" "I don't care," Mark interrupted. "I failed my own daughter. I won't fail the other children who can still be saved." That night, while the men planned their investigation, Vivian put Isabella to bed. The girl was visibly shaken by having relived such traumatic memories. "Vivian," Isabella called when the woman was about to leave the room, "are you mad at me for not being able to save Katerina?" Vivian returned immediately, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Honey, you were just a child. There was no way you could have done more than you did. But she was your real daughter, and I'm just—" "You're ours too now," Vivian interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness of the statement. "Katerina sent you to us. I'm sure of it." 2 hours later, when the house was silent, Isabella awoke from another nightmare. This time, however, the images were different. They weren't confused fragments, but clear and terrifying memories of children being taken away, of screams in the dark, of a man in a white coat doing things she knew were wrong. But there was something more in these recovered memories, something she hadn't told the adults because she wasn't sure if she should. Before being taken to that terrible place, she had a different life. She had parents who loved her, a house with a garden, and a different name. Her real name wasn't Isabella. It was Sophia Venner, and the police officer who had shoved her on the street was her own father, who hadn't recognized her after 2 years of captivity that had completely changed her appearance and personality. As this revelation haunted her thoughts, Isabella heard noises coming from the garden. She approached the window and saw a hooded figure watching the house from the shadows. The person seemed to be studying the movements inside the house, as if they were planning something. Dr. Alvarenga had discovered where she was, and he wouldn't come alone. Isabella's heart beat uncontrollably as she watched the shadowy figure in the garden. Her survival instincts, sharpened by the 2 years of captivity, screamed that the danger was real and imminent. Without making a sound, she left the room and went downstairs, heading to the study where she knew Richard often spent sleepless nights. "There's someone out there," she whispered, touching his arm delicately. Richard looked up from the documents Ted had left, immediately alert. "Where?" "In the garden, a hooded person watching the house." Without hesitation, Richard grabbed the phone and called Ted. In 15 minutes, the investigator arrived accompanied by Mark, both armed with flashlights and determination. But when they searched the garden, they found no one. Only footprints in the damp earth confirmed that Isabella hadn't imagined the presence. "They know she's here," Ted said, examining the marks on the ground. "We need to act fast." The next morning, a decision was made. Isabella would be temporarily transferred to Miriam's house while the men investigated the Alvarenga's rural property. Vivian protested vehemently against the separation, but understood that it was the safest option. "I don't want to go," Isabella said, clinging to Vivian's dress. "I want to stay with you." "It's just for a few days, my love," Vivian promised, using for the first time openly the affectionate terms she had been whispering for weeks. "When we come back, we'll never be separated again." But Isabella knew there was something she needed to reveal before leaving. The weight of the secret about her true identity was becoming unbearable, especially seeing Mark's suffering. "I need to tell you something," she said, gathering all her childish courage. "About who I really am." Everyone in the room turned to her, realizing by the seriousness in her voice that it was something important. "My real name isn't Isabella," she began, her words coming out in trembling whispers. "It's Sophia Venner." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark staggered, needing to lean on the wall, his eyes fixed on the girl who had been before him all along. You're my daughter?" His voice came out hoarse, filled with a mixture of hope and despair. Sophia nodded, tears running down her face. "I didn't recognize you at first because I've changed a lot. And you also look different, sadder." Mark fell to his knees, extending his trembling arms. "My little Sophia, my God, I couldn't recognize you. What kind of father am I?" "A father who has suffered a lot," Sophia replied, running into his arms. "Just like I've suffered. But now we've found each other." The reunion between father and daughter was emotional and devastating at the same time. Mark cried uncontrollably, begging forgiveness for all the lost years, for not being able to protect her, for having been violent in their first encounter. Sophia, in turn, needed to deal with fragmented memories of her previous life, which were slowly coming to the surface. Richard and Vivian watched the scene with conflicting feelings. Relief that Sophia had found her real family, but also a deep pain as they realized they would lose the child they had learned to love as a daughter. "This doesn't change anything," Vivian said firmly, approaching the father and daughter embraced. "Sophia will always have a place in our family too. She brought Katerina back to us in a way we never imagined possible. Miriam observed the complex dynamics unfolding, understanding that the healing process would be long and challenging for all involved. But before they could fully process these revelations, Ted received an urgent call. "The property is empty," his contact informed him, "but we found evidence of recent activity. Makeshift rooms in the basement, medical equipment, partially burned documents." "They've fled," Richard concluded. "Not necessarily," Ted said. "They may have just changed location. Sophia, do you remember any other places where they took the children?" Sophia thought intensely, forcing her mind to revisit painful memories. "Sometimes they talked about a clinic in town, a place where they took children who got very sick or who caused problems." "Dr. Alvarenga's private clinic," Mark murmured. "I always thought it was strange that it operated at irregular hours." It was then that the house phone rang. Richard answered, and the voice on the other end made his blood run cold. "Mr. Sterling." The voice was polite but filled with threat. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Dr. Alvarenga." Richard recognized the voice of the respected pediatrician who had become a nightmare. "Exactly. I'd like to make an exchange. The girl for the safety of your family. You have until tomorrow at noon to decide." The call was cut off, leaving everyone in a state of shock. The threat was clear and terrible. "I won't hand Sophia over to that monster," Mark declared, his voice filled with a fierce determination that he hadn't shown for years. "Neither will I," Richard agreed, "but we need a plan." Ted was already developing a strategy. "We'll pretend to agree to the exchange, but it will be a trap. The state police are already on their way. I called for reinforcements from outside the city to make sure we don't have leaks." Throughout the night, they meticulously prepared the plan. Sophia would be replaced by an undercover policewoman, while she would remain safe with Miriam in a secret location. Mark and Richard would participate in the operation, both determined to end the nightmare that had destroyed so many families definitively. The next morning, as they headed to the meeting point, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, Sophia held Mark's hand. "Dad," she said, and it was the first time she had used that word consciously. "You're not going to lose me again." "Never again," he promised. "And we're going to get justice for all the other children, including Katerina." The confrontation at the warehouse was tense, but successful. Dr. Alvarenga arrived, accompanied by Karen and 2 other accomplices, expecting to receive Sophia in exchange for their freedom. But when they realized they had fallen into a police trap, they tried to flee. The pursuit was brief. Years of crimes had finally caught up with the perpetrators. During the interrogation, Dr. Alvarenga revealed the full extent of the operation. For more than 8 years, he had used his respected position in the community to identify vulnerable children, kidnap them, and exploit them in a network that extended to other cities. The money generated financed a luxurious lifestyle and bought the silence of corrupt authorities. 6 months later, Sophia was almost unrecognizable. The traumatized and distrustful girl had blossomed into a cheerful and confident child. She divided her time between Mark's house, who had become a present and loving father, and the Sterling mansion, where she was treated like the daughter they had always dreamed of having again. Mark had specialized in cases of missing children, transforming his pain into purpose. Richard sold his factory and used the resources to create a shelter for children victims of exploitation. Vivian found her calling working as a volunteer at the center, helping other families to rebuild after traumas. Miriam continued to monitor Sophia, but the sessions were now focused on growth and development, no longer on trauma recovery. The girl had learned to carry the memories of Katerina not as a burden, but as a special responsibility to honor the friend she lost. "Katerina would be happy seeing how we turned out," Sophia said one afternoon, playing in the garden of the Sterling mansion. "She always said that when we were rescued, we were going to have families who would love us very much." "And she was right," replied Vivian, hugging the girl who had become the bridge between the painful past and a future full of hope. The shelter created by Richard became a national reference, helping hundreds of children to reintegrate into society. Sophia, now 8 years old, often visited the facilities, sharing her story of overcoming adversity and offering hope to other children who were still struggling to recover. On the main wall of the center, there was a photo of Katerina Sterling with a plaque that read, "In memory of all the children we lost, and in hope for all those we can still save." Sophia always stopped in front of this photo when visiting the center. "Thank you for sending me to a good family," she whispered. "I promise I'll never forget you." And so, from a deep tragedy, was born a network of love, protection, and dedication that transformed not only Sophia's life, but of hundreds of other children. Evil had left scars, but good had prevailed, proving that even in the darkest situations, hope and love can find a way to the light.